Life inside a Chicago speakeasy in the 1920 seconds was not glamorous in the way films like to suggest. It was not all champagne towers, sharp suits, and effortless laughter. Most of the time, it was dim, cramped, and mildly unpleasant. This was the era of Prohibition, when alcohol was illegal but drinking was somehow more popular than ever. Chicago responded to this contradiction by quietly pretending the law did not exist, as long as everyone involved remained discreet, tired, and willing to bribe the right people. A speakeasy usually hid in plain sight. From the street, it might look like a tailor shop, a basement grocery, or a completely unconvincing social club. Inside, after the correct knock and the brief interrogation by a bored doorman, the room opened into a haze of cigarette smoke and low expectations. Lighting was intentionally bad. This was not for atmosphere, but for safety. Darkness made faces harder to recognize, and events harder to describe later in court. The air was thick, smoke from cheap cigarettes mixed with the smell of spilled alcohol and damp coats. Ventilation was minimal, and nobody seemed particularly concerned about it. Jazz music played in the background, often slightly off-key, sometimes enthusiastic, rarely relaxing. Musicians were paid in drinks as often as cash, which did not improve the quality of the performance over the course of the night. Drinks themselves were inconsistent at best. Since legal distilleries were closed, alcohol came from bootleggers, smugglers, and people who definitely did not list chemistry as a skill. Whiskey might taste like gasoline. Gin was often homemade and occasionally dangerous. To make it tolerable, bartenders added sugar, citrus, or anything else that could distract the mouth from what was happening. Cocktails became popular largely as a form of damage control. The clientele was a mix of people who did not normally belong in the same room. Office clerks drank next to politicians. Factory workers shared tables with gang affiliates. Everyone pretended not to notice anyone else. Conversations stayed shallow. Names were avoided. Trust was limited. This was not a place to overshare, emotionally or legally. Women in speakeasies were more visible than in earlier drinking spaces, but this did not mean equality. They were watched, judged, admired, and criticized all at once. Many came for the novelty and the sense of rebellion. Some worked there, serving drinks or performing, navigating an environment that was loud, smoky, and not especially forgiving. High heels and long nights did not mix well with sticky floors. Police raids were a constant background concern. Most speakeasies survived by paying regular bribes, which were treated as a normal operating expense. When raids did happen, they were often announced in advance. Patrons would finish their drinks calmly, exit through back doors, and complain about the inconvenience. Real panic was rare. Resignation was more common. Despite the risks, people kept coming back. Drinking illegally added a mild thrill to otherwise repetitive lives. For a few hours, people could forget factory shifts, office boredom, or the memory of the recent war. The speakeasy offered distraction, not happiness. It was a pause, not a solution. As the night dragged on, energy faded. Smoke grew heavier. Music slowed. Glasses chipped. Coats were retrieved. People left quietly, stepping back into cold Chicago streets, slightly poorer and not particularly transformed. By morning, the speakeasy would close, chairs overturned, floors sticky, waiting to repeat the same routine again. It was not a golden age. It was simply an age where drinking happened underground, in the dark, with very low ceilings and very tired people. By daylight, the speakeasy did not exist in any meaningful way. Chairs were stacked, bottles hidden behind false walls, and the room returned to its disguise. A tailor shop reopened. A grocery pretended to sell only canned goods. Nothing about the space suggested that, a few hours earlier, it had been full of smoke, noise, and illegal optimism. This daily transformation was routine, and nobody involved found it especially interesting anymore. For the people who ran these places, the work was less romantic than dangerous. Owners kept careful ledgers that were never written down. Supplies arrived at inconvenient hours. Alcohol shipments were lost, diluted, or stolen with impressive efficiency. Profit margins depended not just on customers, but on maintaining good relationships with gangs, suppliers, and local officials who expected payment without receipts. Management was mostly about avoiding trouble, rather than creating a pleasant environment. Employees worked long hours for modest pay. Bartenders memorized faces instead of names. Waitstaff learned to move quickly without drawing attention. Everyone understood that the wrong person overhearing the wrong sentence could end the business, or worse. Job security was low, and benefits were non-existent. Still, steady work was steady work, even if it involved serving questionable liquids to tired strangers in the dark. Chicago's organized crime thrived in this environment, but it was rarely visible inside the speakeasy itself. Violence was bad for business. Most enforcement happened quietly, through threats and agreements rather than public conflict. The goal was stability. A calm speakeasy made money. A chaotic one attracted attention. Attention was the one thing nobody wanted. Customers often imagined themselves as participants in something rebellious and historic. In reality, their actions were repetitive. Order a drink, sit, talk about nothing, listen to music, leave. Night after night, the routine barely changed. The novelty of illegality wore off quickly, replaced by habit. Prohibition did not turn everyone into a criminal mastermind. It mostly turned them into regulars. Fashion played its part, though practicality usually won. Suits absorbed smoke and spilled alcohol. Dresses clung uncomfortably in warm rooms. Coats were necessary outside and burdensome inside. The effort to look stylish often ended in wrinkled fabric and sore feet. By the end of the evening, most people looked less glamorous than when they arrived, despite their best intentions. The music, often remembered fondly, was inconsistent. Some nights featured talented musicians experimenting with new sounds. Other nights featured exhausted performers repeating the same set for the third time that week. Requests were ignored. Tips were unpredictable. Applause was polite but brief. Jazz in a speakeasy was less about artistic expression and more about filling silence. As the years passed, speakeasies multiplied. What began as secretive became common. The thrill diminished further. Everyone knew someone who knew where to drink. Passwords changed frequently, but secrecy was mostly symbolic. Prohibition enforcement varied wildly, and survival often depended on geography rather than cleverness. Some neighborhoods were safer than others, for reasons that were rarely written down. When Prohibition finally ended in 1933, the transition was surprisingly quiet. Speakeasies either closed, rebranded, or became legal bars with slightly better lighting. There were no dramatic finales, no speeches, just paperwork, new licenses, and a gradual shift back into public view. Drinking lost its illegal charm and became ordinary again. Looking back, life inside a 1,920 seconds Chicago speakeasy was less about excitement and more about endurance. Enduring smoke, noise, risk, and mediocre alcohol in exchange for a temporary escape from routine life. It was not a revolution. It was a workaround. And like most workarounds, it was imperfect, mildly exhausting, and eventually unnecessary. In memory, the speakeasy often becomes louder and brighter than it ever was. Stories smooth over the dull parts. Films remove the waiting, the coughing, the quiet moments where nothing happened. In reality, much of speakeasy life involved sitting on hard chairs, nursing a drink that tasted faintly wrong, and wondering how long it would be before it was socially acceptable to leave. Time moved slowly inside these rooms. There were no clocks on the walls, partly to avoid attention, partly because nobody wanted to be reminded how late it was getting. Nights stretched out, measured instead by empty glasses and fading conversations. People talked in circles, repeating the same complaints about work, money, and weather. The illegal setting did not make the topics more interesting. For newcomers, the first visit felt significant. The hidden door, the password, the feeling of being let in on a secret. This sense rarely lasted past the second drink. After that, the speakeasy revealed itself as another crowded room with familiar problems. Noise made real conversation difficult. Smoke irritated eyes and throats. Seating was always limited. Comfort was not part of the business model. Regulars formed quiet routines. They favored certain tables, certain bartenders, certain nights. Familiarity brought a fragile sense of safety, though it was never guaranteed. A speakeasy could vanish overnight, closed by authorities or replaced by a better connected competitor. Loyalty meant little when rent, bribes, and supply chains failed to align. The staff noticed everything and commented on very little. They recognized faces that came too often, drank too much, or talked too freely. A subtle shake of the head, a delayed refill, or a sudden distraction was sometimes enough to prevent trouble. Experience taught them when to intervene and when to disappear into the background. Despite the crowds, loneliness was common. People came to escape isolation, but the environment rarely encouraged genuine connection. Music filled the silence, but also drowned out sincerity. Alcohol lowered inhibitions, while also blurring memory. Many left feeling no closer to anyone than when they arrived, only more tired. Money flowed unevenly. Some nights were profitable, others barely covered costs. A good week could be undone by a single missed payment or unexpected visit from the wrong official. Financial stress hung over the operation. Even when the room appeared busy, success was fragile, temporary, and never guaranteed. Outside, Chicago continued its usual rhythms. Streetcars rattled past. Snow piled up in winter. Heat lingered in summer. The speakeasy existed alongside ordinary life, not separate from it. Factory whistles still blew. Offices still opened in the morning. Most patrons returned to predictable routines, carrying the faint smell of smoke and regret with them. By the late years of Prohibition, fatigue set in. Drinking illegally stopped feeling rebellious and started feeling inconvenient. People wanted better drinks, cleaner rooms, and fewer secrets. The excitement had been replaced by maintenance. Keeping the illusion alive required effort that fewer people were willing to provide. When historians look back, they often focus on the symbolism of the speakeasy: resistance, freedom, cultural change. But on an average night, it was simply a place where people went because it existed. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was available. The chairs were uncomfortable. The drinks were unreliable. The air was thick. Yet, people showed up, night after night, until the law changed, and they no longer had to. The speakeasy did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it was no longer necessary. In the end, life inside a 1,920 seconds, Chicago speakeasy was quiet in its own way, not silent, but subdued. A slow hum of conversation, clinking glass, and tired ambition. It was history happening softly, in the background, while most people were just trying to get through the evening and home again. Even after the doors closed for good, the habits lingered. Former speakeasy owners became bar owners, bringing with them the same low expectations and practical instincts. They kept the lights dimmer than necessary, trusted familiar suppliers, and remained cautious long after caution was required. Old routines are difficult to abandon, especially when they once kept you out of prison. For patrons, the change was subtle. Legal bars felt strangely exposed. Windows were uncovered. Doors opened without passwords. Drinks were listed openly, without euphemism. For some, this transparency was a relief. For others, it felt like something private had been lost. Drinking in public lacked the quiet intimacy of shared secrecy, even if the chairs were more comfortable and the alcohol less alarming. Many former speakeasies left no trace at all. Buildings were renovated, repurposed, or demolished. Basements were flooded, walls knocked down, false panels discarded. Any remaining evidence of hidden bars faded into rumor. A staircase that went nowhere. A bricked-up doorway. A story told by someone who claimed to know someone who once drank there. Proof was rarely necessary. Those who had worked long nights inside remembered the fatigue more than the excitement, the constant noise, the smoke that never fully washed out of clothes, the tension of listening for unfamiliar footsteps. When asked later, few described it as a good time. It was work. It was stress. It was survival in a city that rewarded adaptability more than idealism. The mythology grew stronger as memory softened. Decades later, speakeasies became symbols of creativity and resistance, rather than inconvenience. Jazz improved with time. Cocktails became elegant. Conversations became meaningful. Reality was adjusted to fit nostalgia. This was easier than remembering sticky floors and the taste of improperly distilled spirits. Tourists eventually went looking for speakeasies that no longer existed. Bars adopted the name, the style, the suggestion of secrecy, without the risk. Passwords were printed on menus. Hidden doors were advertised. Illegality became a theme, not a condition. What was once necessary became decorative. Yet, something about the speakeasy still appealed. The idea of gathering quietly, of stepping out of public life into a dimmer, slower space, of sharing an experience that felt slightly removed from the ordinary world. Even when everything was legal, people continued to seek that feeling. Not rebellion, exactly, just privacy. In this way, the speakeasy outlived prohibition, not as a place, but as a mood, a preference for low light, soft music, and modest expectations, a desire to disappear for a few hours without explanation. The setting changed, but the impulse remained familiar. Looking back with clear eyes, life in a 1,920 seconds, Chicago Speakeasy was not extraordinary. It was repetitive, uncomfortable, and occasionally dangerous. It did not transform its patrons or improve society. It simply provided a space where people could pause, drink, and forget, briefly, about the rules pressing in from outside. And perhaps that is why it is remembered at all, not because it was exciting, but because it was ordinary in an unusual way. A routine carried out under pressure, a habit formed in the dark. History, happening quietly, while most people were just trying to get through the night. In the end, the speakeasy was less a celebration and more a compromise between law and desire, between public virtue and private exhaustion. It existed because people needed somewhere to sit, to talk, and to drink something stronger than patience. Then, when it was no longer needed, it faded, not with drama, but with paperwork and better lighting. Like many things in history, it ended not with a bang, but with a sigh and the slow realization that everyone was ready to go home. Long after the last drink was poured, the idea of the speakeasy settled into history as something heavier than it deserved. Writers gave it meaning. Designers gave it style. Everyone agreed it must have been important, because it was illegal and survived anyway. But for the people who lived it, night after night, it was mostly a matter of routine and tolerance. Most patrons did not think of themselves as rebels. They thought of themselves as tired. After long workdays, the speakeasy was simply closer than home, warmer than the street, and marginally more interesting than sitting alone. The law was distant and abstract. Fatigue was immediate. People chose the immediate problem. Inside, the same rituals repeated. Coats hung from the same hooks. Glasses were wiped with the same cloths that never quite got clean. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else coughed for too long. The piano missed a note. Nobody commented. Familiarity dulled everything, including the risk. There were nights when nothing went wrong at all. No raids, no arguments, no excitement. Just hours passing slowly, one after another. These nights were the most common and the least remembered. History rarely records evenings where people drank quietly, spoke briefly, and left without incident. Even the danger was uneven. Some speakeasies operated for years without interruption. Others vanished suddenly. Success depended on location, connections, and luck. Hard work helped, but not reliably. The uncertainty wore on everyone involved. Stability was temporary. Planning too far ahead felt optimistic. For the surrounding neighborhoods, speakeasies blended into the background. Residents learned which doors to ignore and which noises to accept. Complaints were rare. Intervention was selective. The city absorbed these spaces without much resistance. Chicago had larger problems to worry about. As time passed, prohibition itself became exhausting. Enforcement was inconsistent. Public support faded. The effort required to maintain the ban outweighed any benefits people could still pretend to see. By the early 1,930 seconds, the country was ready to stop arguing about alcohol and focus on surviving economic collapse instead. When repeal finally came, it felt less like victory and more like relief. The performance ended. The pretending stopped. People drank openly, and life continued with slightly better organization. The speakeasy slipped quietly into the past, where it could be edited, romanticized, and simplified. What remains is not the reality, but the atmosphere. Dim, light, soft noise, a sense of being tucked away from responsibility. These elements survive because they answer a persistent human desire to step aside briefly, without explanation, and rest. Life in a 1,920 seconds, Chicago Speakeasy, was not a defining experience for most who entered one. It did not change their beliefs or redirect their futures. It filled time. It offered distraction. It allowed people to sit down at the end of the day and feel slightly less alone, even if conversation was shallow and drinks were questionable. In that sense, it was not unique. Many places have served the same function, under different names and laws. The speakeasy just happened to do it quietly, in the dark, with the door locked. And so it settles into history the way it existed in life. Not loudly, not dramatically, just there for a while, doing its job, then closing its doors when they were no longer needed. A place where nothing much happened, over and over again, until that nothing became a story worth telling softly, late at night, when everyone else has already gone home. By the time historians began paying serious attention to speakeasies, most of the people who had depended on them were already gone. What remained were second-hand memories, softened by time and selective attention. The discomfort faded first, the boredom followed. What stayed was the idea that something secret must also have been meaningful. In daily reality, meaning was not the goal. Function was. The speakeasy functioned as a place to pause between obligations, a gap in the schedule, a dim room where expectations were low and conversation did not need to lead anywhere. In a decade marked by rapid change, noise, and uncertainty, this quiet predictability mattered more than excitement. Alcohol was only part of the attraction. The larger appeal was permission to linger, to sit without purpose, to delay returning home, where responsibilities waited patiently. For some, the speakeasy was the only place where time felt slightly less structured, even if it passed just as slowly. No one stayed forever. Even the most loyal regular eventually stopped coming. Work changed, health declined, laws shifted. The habit dissolved without ceremony. A final visit often went unnoticed. There were no farewells, just absence, absorbed quietly into the routine of the room. The speakeasy never asked for devotion. It did not promise improvement or transformation. It offered consistency, and that was enough. A chair, a glass, music that filled space without demanding attention. In a restless era, this modest offering carried surprising weight. When modern bars recreate speakeasies, they borrow the surface but miss the context. The risk is simulated. The secrecy is theatrical. What cannot be recreated is the exhaustion that made such places necessary. Without that fatigue, the atmosphere becomes decoration rather than refuge. Life in a 1,922nd Chicago speakeasy belonged to its moment. It was shaped by laws that did not align with behavior, by cities that grew faster than comfort, and by people learning to endure uncertainty as a daily condition. The speakeasy did not solve these problems. It merely existed alongside them. And perhaps that is why it remains quietly fascinating. Not because it was heroic or rebellious, but because it was ordinary under pressure. A simple response to complicated circumstances. A place that did not try to be remembered, yet was. In the end, the speakeasy leaves behind no clear lesson, only an image of tired people in a dark room, doing what they could to make the evening pass. History often turns such scenes into symbols, but at the time, they were just nights, unfolding slowly, one after another, until sleep finally became the better option. And that, in its own unremarkable way, is where the story rests. As with many parts of everyday history, the speakeasy did not announce its significance while it existed. No one inside believed they were participating in something future generations would analyze. People were more concerned with whether the chair would hold, whether the drink was tolerable, and whether the night would end without complication. Historical importance is easier to assign after everyone involved has gone home. The city itself shaped the experience. Chicago in the 1,920 was loud, expanding, and impatient. Industry moved quickly. Neighborhoods shifted. The speakeasy absorbed this restlessness and slowed it down, just slightly. Inside, movement was limited. Space was tight. Everything happened at a reduced pace, not by design, but by necessity. Silence was rare, but quiet moments existed, between songs, between conversations, in the pause after a glass was set down and before it was refilled. These moments were brief, but noticeable. They gave the night its rhythm. Not excitement, but repetition. Not drama, but delay. For some, the speakeasy became part of their internal map of the city, not marked on paper, but remembered by turns, stairwells, and unremarkable doors. Directions were given indirectly. Near the tracks, past the bakery, the city developed a second layer, invisible but well known to those who needed it. This hidden geography was practical rather than romantic. It existed to avoid attention, not to invite mystery. People learned quickly which routes were safe and which were not worth the effort. Curiosity was less useful than caution. Survival depended on predictability. As years passed, younger patrons arrived with no memory of legal drinking. For them, the speakeasy was not a workaround, but the default. Illegality felt normal. The absence of alcohol in public spaces was the oddity. This generational shift further drained the experience of novelty. It was simply how things were. Older patrons noticed the difference. They remembered brighter rooms, clearer rules, and drinks that did not require explanation. Some stopped coming. Others adapted. Most did not comment. Change was constant enough that reflection felt unnecessary. In quieter corners, people dozed briefly, heads tilted forward, coats still on. No one objected. Sleep was respected. A man asleep was less likely to cause trouble than one still drinking. Fatigue was understood as part of the environment, not a failure to enjoy it. Eventually, as repeal approached, anticipation crept in. Not excitement, but calculation. Owners planned, suppliers adjusted, patrons speculated quietly about prices and locations. The speakeasy continued to operate, even as its purpose began to dissolve. When the end arrived, it did not feel like history. It felt administrative. Licenses were issued, signs were replaced. The lights came up slightly. The same people sat in the same rooms, doing roughly the same things, only now without the pretense. And so, the speakeasy completed its cycle, from necessity to habit, from habit to memory. It did not demand to be remembered, but it was. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it revealed something ordinary about people. When rules and needs conflict, people find a quiet place to sit and wait it out. Life in a 1,920 seconds. Chicago Speakeasy was not a story of excess. It was a story of endurance, of passing time in low light, of making the evening tolerable. History often prefers sharper edges. This one remains soft, dim, and slow, which makes it, perhaps unintentionally, a very good story to fall asleep to. Near the very end of Prohibition, people inside speakeasies began behaving as if the rules had already changed. Glasses were left out a little longer. Doors stayed open a little wider. The sense of urgency softened. Everyone understood, without needing to say it, that the performance was nearly over. The danger had thinned to background noise. Owners stopped investing in elaborate concealment. False walls were no longer repaired carefully. Hidden compartments stuck. Locks failed and were not replaced. The effort no longer felt worthwhile. Energy shifted from hiding to preparing for what came next, even if nobody was entirely sure what that would look like. For staff, this period was strangely calm. The tension that had shaped every shift for years slowly released. Not all at once, but enough to be noticed. Fewer whispered conversations, less scanning of faces. The job became, briefly, just a job. Serve drinks, clear tables, close up, go home. Patrons sensed the change too. Conversations turned practical. Which places would reopen legally? Which owners would survive? Which neighborhoods would benefit? Speculation replaced secrecy. The speakeasy, once a refuge from rules, became a place to discuss them. When repeal finally arrived, some expected celebration. What followed instead was adjustment. Legal bars were brighter, louder, and more regulated. Inspections replaced bribes. Paperwork replaced passwords. For many, this was an improvement. For others, it felt oddly sterile. Comfort had increased, but intimacy had not. The last speakeasy nights passed without ceremony. No announcements were made. No one counted down. One evening was simply the final one. Chairs were stacked for the last time. Bottles were moved permanently into open view. The hidden door was left unlocked, then eventually removed. Years later, memory did the rest. What had once been dull gained texture. What had been uncomfortable gained charm. Stories grew smoother with retelling. The waiting, the smoke, the fatigue were edited out. Only mood remained. But if you could sit quietly in one of those rooms, back when it mattered, you would notice how little was actually happening, how slowly the night moved, how ordinary the people were, how much of the time was spent simply sitting, listening, and waiting for nothing in particular. That ordinariness is the most accurate detail history often forgets. Life in a 1,920 seconds. Chicago Speakeasy was not about thrill or rebellion. It was about filling hours under constraint. It was about small comforts in an inconvenient world. It was about staying awake long enough to justify going home later. And so the story ends the way it lived, without urgency, without spectacle. Just a room growing quieter, people drifting out, and the city continuing on outside, unchanged by the fact that, for a while, people preferred to drink in the dark and say as little as possible. That was enough. And for many nights, it was all anyone really needed. After repeal, the memory of speakeasies began drifting away from the people who had actually spent time in them. What remained were outlines rather than details, a sense of darkness, a suggestion of music, the idea of something hidden. The parts that caused discomfort were quietly discarded, as they usually are. Those who tried to explain the experience later often struggled. There was no single moment that defined it, no clear turning point. Nights blended together. One drink resembled the next. One conversation faded into another. Even the fear, which sounded dramatic in retrospect, was mostly a dull awareness rather than a sharp emotion. In daily life, the speakeasy did not stand apart. It fit into routines the same way everything else did. People went after work, before dinner, or instead of going home at all. It was rarely an event. More often, it was a stop, a place between obligations, where nothing was required except sitting and waiting. The furniture bore the evidence of this use. Chairs loosened, tables wobbled, repairs were temporary. Nothing was meant to last long. Investment beyond necessity felt risky. Permanence was avoided. Even decorations were minimal, chosen less for beauty than for ease of removal. Sound traveled poorly in these rooms. Conversations overlapped and dissolved into background noise. Words lost their edges. Meaning became optional. People nodded without fully hearing. Responses were delayed. Silence was accepted. In a decade filled with slogans, speeches, and noise, this lack of clarity was strangely welcome. For many, the speakeasy was the only place where they could sit without being productive. Work demanded effort. Home demanded responsibility. Public spaces demanded attention. The speakeasy demanded very little. You could arrive tired and leave tired, without needing to explain yourself. This is part of why it resisted moral framing. It was not clearly good or bad. It did not elevate or corrupt. It simply existed, absorbing whatever people brought with them and returning very little in response. That neutrality made it easy to forget and easy to miss once it was gone. As years passed, stories hardened into tropes. Gangsters appeared where clerks had sat. Passion replaced boredom. Music improved retroactively. The speakeasy became a stage rather than a room, a setting rather than an environment. This version was easier to sell, easier to remember, and far less accurate. The real legacy was quieter. It lived on in preferences, low lighting, soft music, corners rather than center tables, a dislike of bright rooms and loud certainty. These habits survived long after Prohibition ended, passed down without explanation. People who had once relied on speakeasies did not mourn them openly. There were no anniversaries, no memorials, just occasional comments. It was different back then, followed by a pause, followed by something else entirely. History tends to favor moments of action. The speakeasy offers mostly inaction, sitting, waiting, listening without fully engaging. It resists summarization because it was not trying to say anything. It filled space. It passed time. That was enough. Life in a 1,920 seconds, Chicago speakeasy was defined less by what happened and more by what did not. No speeches, no transformations, no clear outcomes, just evenings that ended eventually, whether people were ready or not. And perhaps that is why it fits so naturally into quiet history. It does not insist on attention. It does not demand excitement. It simply invites you to sit for a while, in low light, with minimal expectations, until the night is over and it is time to go home, which, for most people who ever entered one, was always the plan. Eventually, even the people who remembered speakeasies clearly stopped talking about them. The stories ran out. The details blurred. New decades arrived with louder distractions and brighter places to drink. What had once felt necessary became irrelevant, then curious, then decorative. What remains now is mostly atmosphere, detached from experience. Dim lights without smoke, jazz without exhaustion, secrecy without consequence. These are pleasant imitations, but they lack the weight that gave the original spaces their meaning. Without pressure, the quiet feels optional rather than earned. The original speakeasy was shaped by constraint, by laws that ignored reality, by cities that demanded constant motion, by people who were tired before they even arrived. Remove those conditions, and what is left is just a room. And that room, in its time, was never trying to be special. It did not aim to inspire. It did not claim significance. It existed because it solved a small, immediate problem: where to sit, where to drink, where to let the evening pass without too much attention. Life inside a 1,920 seconds. Chicago Speakeasy was not lived with awareness of history. It was lived one slow hour at a time. People arrived, stayed longer than planned, and left when the night finally felt complete enough. No one marked the moment. It simply happened. This is often how history actually works, not in sharp scenes or dramatic shifts, but in repetition, in habits formed under pressure, in compromises that make daily life tolerable. The Speakeasy fits neatly into this pattern. It was not a rebellion, it was an adjustment, and adjustments rarely announce themselves. So when we talk about speakeasies now, softly, late at night, we are not really talking about crime or culture or law. We are talking about tired people looking for somewhere to rest without explanation, somewhere dim, somewhere temporary, somewhere that would not ask much in return. For a while, the Speakeasy did that job. Then it stopped. The doors opened, the lights came up, the city moved on, and the rooms that once held so many slow evenings returned to being just rooms again. Quietly, when you strip away the nostalgia entirely, what remains is something very simple. The Speakeasy was not built to be remembered. It was built to function, to hold people, to absorb time, to exist just long enough to serve its purpose, and then disappear without asking for thanks. Most nights ended the same way. Someone checked the door, someone else gathered coats. Conversations trailed off mid-thought. Goodbyes were brief, often unnecessary. People left in small groups or alone, stepping back into streets that looked exactly as they had before. Nothing about the outside world suggested anything unusual had just taken place. The following day erased what little evidence remained. Floors were scrubbed, ashtrays emptied, bottles hidden. By afternoon, the space resumed its other identity, blending back into the city's surface. The transformation was so complete that it became easy to doubt the previous night had mattered at all. For those who depended on speakeasies, this impermanence was expected. Everything about the arrangement was temporary. Laws would change, businesses would close, people would move on. The speakeasy never promised permanence, and no one asked it to. This is why it fits poorly into dramatic history. It does not lend itself to clear conclusions. It does not offer heroes or villains in any satisfying way. It offers only a pattern: pressure, adaptation, routine, fatigue, and eventual release. Life in a 1,920 seconds. Chicago Speakeasy followed that pattern quietly. It unfolded without commentary, without intention to influence anything beyond the next few hours. People did not gather there to challenge authority or shape culture. They gathered because the door was open and the light inside was low. In many ways, this makes the Speakeasy more honest than the stories told about it later. It reflects how most people experience history, indirectly, passively, while focused on personal concerns that feel far more important at the time. The big ideas come later. The living happens first. So if you imagine yourself sitting there, late at night, surrounded by smoke and half-heard music, the most accurate feeling is not excitement. It is mild relief. Relief that you do not have to be anywhere else. Relief that nothing is expected of you for a while. That feeling, quiet and unremarkable, is the true legacy of the Speakeasy, and it is enough to let the story end here. That quiet relief did not announce itself as comfort. It arrived gradually, settling in once the body realized it could stop moving. Shoulders lowered, breathing slowed. The room, for all its faults, held steady. Nothing demanded urgency. Nothing needed fixing. For a brief stretch of time, existence narrowed to the simple act of being present. People rarely spoke about this part. It was not impressive. It could not be exaggerated convincingly, but it was what kept them returning. Not the thrill of defiance, but the permission to pause. In a decade obsessed with progress and productivity, the Speakeasy offered something unfashionable: stillness. Even the music reflected this. Jazz in these rooms was not always sharp or revolutionary. Often it was repetitive, almost hypnotic. A melody would circle back on itself, stretch, then resolve slowly. It filled the space without insisting on attention. You could listen, or you could let it fade into the background entirely. Alcohol helped, but it was not essential. Some nights, the drinks were barely touched. A glass might sit untouched for long minutes, becoming a prop rather than a necessity. Being there mattered more than consuming anything. The ritual mattered more than the substance. This is why the speakeasy does not fit neatly into narratives of excess. Excess was expensive. It attracted notice. Most people practiced moderation, not out of virtue, but out of caution and fatigue. Staying unnoticed required restraint. As midnight passed and the room thinned slightly, conversations became softer. People leaned back rather than forward. The energy shifted downward. Laughter became occasional, not constant. The night loosened its grip. Leaving felt easier. No one lingered dramatically. There was no final song that everyone remembered. No closing announcement. The end of an evening was a slow agreement between strangers that it was time to stop. One person stood. Another followed. The room emptied without resistance. Outside, the city absorbed them again. Cold air cleared smoke from coats and hair. Streetlights offered blunt clarity. The transition was always abrupt. The speakeasy did not prepare you for the outside world. It simply released you into it. The next day, life resumed without reference to what had happened. Work did not pause. Responsibilities did not soften. The speakeasy did not improve circumstances. It merely provided a small, quiet interruption. And perhaps that is why it remains strangely compelling. Not because it promised more, but because it promised less. Less noise, less scrutiny, less expectation. For people carrying too much already, this was enough. Life in a 1,920 seconds. Chicago Speakeasy did not make history louder. It made it slower. It created pockets of time where nothing much needed to happen, where being awake was optional, and sleep was not yet required. In the end, the speakeasy leaves behind no instruction and no warning, only a suggestion that sometimes, when the world feels too rigid, people will find a dim room, close the door, lower their voices, and wait, quietly, until the night passes. Over time, even that quiet waiting became harder to remember accurately. Memory prefers edges, not pauses. It selects moments that move or surprise, and quietly drops the long stretches where nothing shifted at all. The speakeasy lived mostly in those dropped stretches, hours that felt long while they were happening, and then vanished almost completely afterward. If you asked someone years later what they did in a speakeasy, they might struggle to answer. They went there. They sat. They drank something. They talked. A little. They listened. Not closely. The experience resisted detail because detail was never the point. The value was in duration, not content. This made the speakeasy strangely resistant to ownership. It did not belong fully to its owners, its staff, or its patrons. It existed as a shared pause, maintained collectively through restraint and silence. No one pushed it too far. No one asked too much of it. That balance, fragile and unspoken, kept it functioning. Even disagreements were muted. Arguments rarely escalated. Voices stayed low. A glance from a bartender or a subtle shift in music was often enough to end a tense moment. Everyone understood that disruption threatened the space itself. Peace was practical, not moral. For people living through economic uncertainty, political noise, and rapid urban growth, this practicality mattered. The speakeasy did not solve problems, but it did not add new ones either. It offered a narrow promise and kept it. That reliability, however modest, was rare. As years passed, the rooms aged quietly. Paint darkened, wood absorbed smoke, fabrics wore thin. The spaces grew more comfortable in an unintentional way, shaped by repeated use rather than design. Nothing was pristine. Everything was familiar. There was also a certain kindness in how anonymity functioned. People could be present without being examined. They could sit with their thoughts without being asked to explain them. In a world that increasingly demanded performance, this absence of scrutiny was a relief. Eventually, of course, time moved on. The conditions that created speakeasies dissolved. Laws shifted. Cities reorganized themselves. The need for hidden rooms faded, but the habit of seeking quiet places did not disappear with them. You can see it afterward, in legal bars that kept their lights low, in cafes designed for lingering rather than speed, in corners of cities where people still gather to do very little together. These are not copies. They are descendants. The speakeasy did not invent this desire. It simply met it under pressure, and because it met it without ceremony, it passed without one as well. When the last nights came, they felt no different from the many nights before. That is perhaps the most accurate ending. No climax, no lesson delivered clearly. Just another evening that concluded when people stood up, reached for their coats, and left. History often asks for meaning where there was none. It looks for intention in places that were shaped by necessity. The speakeasy resists this gently. It offers no argument. It simply existed, quietly, until it did not. Life in a 1,920 seconds, Chicago Speakeasy was not dramatic enough to demand attention. It was steady, dim, repetitive, and tired. And for the people who passed through it, that was exactly what made it useful. Nothing more was required. So, the story slows and settles and does not ask to be continued. Like the rooms themselves, it closes without announcement, leaving behind only the impression of low light, soft sound, and time spent without urgency. And that, finally, is where it rests. At some point, even the act of remembering slows down. The speakeasy becomes less a place and more a feeling that resists clear shape. Ask people what it looked like, and answers differ. Ask how it felt, and there is a pause. The pause is the most accurate response. What most people carried away from those rooms was not excitement, but a softened edge. The night had been endured rather than conquered. The day ahead felt slightly farther away. That small distance mattered. It was enough to make tomorrow feel manageable. This was never discussed openly. There was no shared language for it. People did not arrive saying they needed rest from the world. They said nothing at all. They took a seat, accepted a glass, and let the room do its quiet work. The speakeasy did not heal. It did not inspire. It simply reduced the volume. Over time, repetition created familiarity. Familiarity created tolerance. Tolerance created attachment. Not the kind that demands loyalty, but the kind that accepts return without expectation. If the speakeasy was there, you went. If it was gone, you adjusted. Life continued either way. This adaptability defined the era more than rebellion ever did. Prohibition forced people to become flexible. Rules shifted. Enforcement wavered. Certainty disappeared. The speakeasy fit neatly into this uncertainty, offering something that did not pretend to be permanent or righteous. It was honest about its limitations. When people later spoke of freedom, they often meant this modest freedom, the freedom to sit without explanation, to exist without being examined, to let the evening pass without consequence. Not grand liberty, just temporary relief. As decades passed, this subtle understanding faded. Noise increased. Speed became expected. Public spaces demanded purpose. Sitting quietly grew suspicious. The idea that a place could exist simply to absorb time became harder to justify. And so, the speakeasy gained weight in memory, precisely because what it offered became rarer. It was no longer just about alcohol or law. It became shorthand for something lost. Unstructured time shared quietly with others. But in its own moment, it never claimed that role. It did not know what it was preserving. It did not understand what it would come to represent. It functioned, night after night, without ambition. That lack of ambition is what allowed it to remain gentle. It did not ask people to be better, louder, or more interesting. It accepted them as they were, tired and unfinished. Few places do that, then or now. Eventually, the city moved forward. Buildings changed. Laws simplified. People adapted, as they always do. The speakeasy slipped out of use, then out of memory, then into stylized nostalgia. The real thing remained unrecorded, lived rather than documented. If you listen carefully to the stories that survived, you can hear the gaps, the long evenings summarized in a sentence, the hours reduced to atmosphere. Those gaps are not failures of memory. They are evidence of how the experience actually unfolded. Nothing dramatic happened there, most of the time. And that is why it mattered. Life in a 1,920 seconds. Chicago Speakeasy was not a rebellion written in bold letters. It was a footnote written in pencil. Easy to erase, easy to overlook, but quietly present while the rest of history rushed past. And perhaps that is the most fitting way to let it end. Not with a final image or a strong conclusion, but with the same soft fade it always had. People standing up, chairs shifting slightly, the door opening just enough, cold air entering, warm air leaving. Then the room empties, the light goes out, and the night, having done very little at all, is finally over. By the time the night fully ended, the room itself seemed to sigh. Tables were cleared, chairs stacked, and the faint smell of smoke lingered, stubbornly refusing to leave. The walls, darkened by years of dim lamplight and cigarette haze, bore silent witness to countless nights of quiet endurance. No one praised them, no one noticed, and that, somehow, was exactly as it should have been. The people who had been inside moved back into the city's rhythm. Streets were cold. Streetcars rattled past. Factory whistles and office bells resumed their demands. Any sense of adventure or defiance evaporated in the open air. What remained of the speakeasy existed only as a faint echo on coats, in hair, in the memory of a slightly slower evening. For most, the experience left nothing permanent. There were no lasting friendships, no bold decisions, no dramatic revelations. What was gained was simpler. A few hours of time stretched just a little differently. A minor reprieve from rules and responsibilities. A dimly lit pause before the day pressed back in. Even the operators of these rooms, who once worked tirelessly to conceal and maintain them, noticed the subtle relief in the shift. The last drinks poured without urgency. The last patrons left without fanfare. And when the doors finally closed for good, no one lingered unnecessarily. The speakeasy had fulfilled its purpose quietly, efficiently, without recognition. In retrospect, historians and storytellers would try to frame it as glamorous or rebellious. Films would add glamour, novels would add intrigue, but the truth was mundane, almost banal, and in that banality lay its peculiar significance. It existed not to astonish, but to endure, not to inspire, but to simply hold a space for the living, tired, breathing, thinking, and waiting. Life in a 1,920 seconds Chicago speakeasy was therefore defined by its absence of spectacle. It was about small, slow things. The shuffle of chairs, the clink of glass, the faint hum of music, the occasional cough, the soft murmur of conversation that went nowhere. It was about occupying a few hours without drama, without expectation, and without consequence. And so, as all nights inevitably do, it ended. The city resumed its usual rhythm. The doors closed, the light dimmed, the air cleared slowly, and the quiet, low-lit pause that had temporarily existed faded entirely, leaving only memory, or rather, what memory chose to retain. In its simplicity, the speakeasy left behind a lesson almost nobody noticed. Sometimes the most enduring stories are not those of heroism or disaster, but of people simply existing in low light, enduring the night, and letting it pass. And there, finally, the story rests. After the doors were shut, and the last patrons had slipped into the cold Chicago night, the speakeasy seemed to exist in two states at once, gone, and still present in the memory of those who had been inside. For them, the night lingered faintly on coats, in the smell of smoke that clung stubbornly to hair, in the faint echo of music that had never been particularly good, but had filled the space enough to make silence bearable. The rooms themselves, stripped of bodies and light, became inert. Tables, chairs, and worn floorboards held no secret or thrill. They simply waited, quietly, for another night that would never come. Walls that had once muffled, whispered passwords and muted conversations now reflected nothing but emptiness. Even the faint stickiness on the floors, testimony to spilled drinks, and the passage of countless feet served as a muted reminder that this space had functioned, however uneventfully, in human life. For the city outside, life continued as if nothing had happened. Streetcars rattled, vendors called, and factory whistles punctuated the daily rhythm. The speakeasy, for all its illicit purpose, had never altered the broader currents of Chicago life. It had been a pause, a temporary container for human presence, modestly defiant, quietly tolerated, and ultimately forgettable. Those who had frequented it carried the memory lightly, not a badge of rebellion, nor a story of adventure, but a faint awareness of having occupied a small, dimly lit space where nothing was required and little was expected. They could step out into the streets and rejoin the demands of life, carrying with them only the slight sense that, for a few hours, the world had slowed just enough to be endured. Time moved forward, Prohibition ended. Speakeasies either transformed into legitimate bars or faded entirely. Memories dulled. Stories softened. The smoke, the laughter, the minor discomforts, these all became vague, pleasant abstractions rather than lived experience. And in that quiet fading lies the essence of the speakeasy, not as an icon of resistance, nor as a symbol of lawlessness, but as a small, low-lit space where ordinary people passed time, tolerated each other's presence, and let the evening drift past. It existed for no grand reason, and its significance is only apparent in hindsight, in the gentle recollection that people once simply sat and waited and endured. Life in a 1,920 seconds. Chicago Speakeasy was ordinary, imperfect, slow, and, in its own unobtrusive way, enough. And with that, the night finally lets go. Over the following years, even the faintest traces of those nights became harder to locate. Buildings were renovated, floors replaced, walls repainted. Any physical reminders, the stickiness on tables, the smoke-darkened wood, the crooked chairs, slowly disappeared. The space that once quietly held hours of waiting and muted conversation was absorbed back into the ordinary city. The hidden entrances vanished, leaving behind nothing more than doorways or stairwells that seemed unremarkable to anyone passing by. Patrons moved on as well. Jobs, marriages, and responsibilities drew them away. The thrill, or lack thereof, of illicit drinking faded under the weight of daily life. Some carried stories, simplified and softened with time, while others retained only the faintest impression that they had once occupied a dim, smoky room where nothing much happened but time passed. Even the memory of discomfort, the tight chairs, the uneven floors, the odd taste of bootleg liquor, became a detail easily overlooked. The staff who had worked those nights also dispersed. Bartenders found new work, servers returned to legal establishments, owners either adapted or closed permanently. No one mourned the loss of the room itself. Its function had been served, to hold people in a temporary pause from the world outside. That was all it had ever promised. What remained was a quiet echo, a sense of hours stretched under dim light and low expectations. The significance of the speakeasy grew only later, when stories turned minor inconvenience into cultural myth, when people assigned nostalgia to routine, when the mundane became charming in retrospect. Yet the reality was simple. Nights in a speakeasy were ordinary. People arrived, occupied space, consumed drinks of varying quality, endured smoke and noise, and eventually left. No heroics, no drama, just the slow passage of time in low light. And that is the story's true legacy. The quiet endurance of ordinary people in an ordinary place, under circumstances that required vigilance, patience, and a tolerance for imperfection. In the end, life in a 1,920 seconds, Chicago Speakeasy is remembered not for excitement, but for its subtle, almost imperceptible rhythm. The clink of glasses, the shuffle of chairs, the faint hum of music, the slow breathing of tired people, and the quiet acknowledgement that the night would pass, eventually, for everyone. And with that acknowledgement, the room, the people, and the night itself dissolved gently into memory, leaving only the faint impression of low light, patience, and time quietly endured. As decades passed, the memory of speakeasies continued to soften, like smoke curling toward the ceiling and dissipating into air. Stories became smaller, selective. The long pauses between events, the quiet endurance, the mundane shuffling of chairs, the slow passing of hours were almost always omitted. What survived was either the thrill of illegality, the imagined glamour of hidden rooms, or a fleeting anecdote of someone's drink spilling. The reality, slow and ordinary, faded almost entirely. People who had once frequented these rooms rarely spoke of them in detail. The dullness was too persistent to narrate, the repetitive small inconveniences too unimpressive to remember clearly. They recalled only the feeling, dim light, low conversation, slight relief from the expectations of the day, and the steady rhythm of time passing without pressure. Even the city absorbed these nights quietly. Streetcars rattled along the same tracks. Sidewalks grew warmer in summer and slippery in winter, and factories and offices demanded attention just as they had before anyone had slipped behind a false door. The speakeasy had never altered the city's pulse. It had only offered a minor diversion within it. Those who had worked behind the bar or in the kitchen carried its memory differently. They remembered hours of monotony, punctuated by brief moments of minor excitement. A familiar face, a near raid, a particularly clever cocktail. Mostly, though, they remembered endurance, staying awake, staying aware, staying just quiet enough. The work was repetitive, tiring, and never glamorous. By the time the legal bars took over, the speakeasy's function was obsolete. Its patrons adapted. Its owners either moved on or transformed their businesses, and the rooms themselves either disappeared or became ordinary spaces. What had existed in secret returned to everyday life, without ceremony, without recognition. And yet, in the absence of dramatic events, a subtle legacy remained. The quiet tolerance for small discomforts, the endurance of hours with minimal action, the low-lit patience, these echoes persisted in the way people gathered in rooms, long after Prohibition ended. Not the speakeasy itself, but its manner of inhabiting time. Life in a 1,920 seconds. Chicago Speakeasy, when stripped of myth, was ordinary, slow, and remarkably persistent in memory, only because of its subtlety. Nothing spectacular occurred. People arrived. People sat. People left. The room held them while they waited for nothing significant to happen, and that is all it ever promised. Quietly, slowly, unremarkably. Over the years, even the faint traces of those quiet nights continued to fade. The stickiness of spilled drinks was scrubbed away. Smoke-darkened wood was refinished. Hidden doors were removed, replaced with ordinary entrances. The physical space that had once contained hours of slow endurance disappeared into the ordinary architecture of the city. Passers-by had no reason to suspect that, decades earlier, people had lingered there in low light, doing very little but existing. For those who had been there, memory softened in the same way. The dim lighting became gentle, the smoke became aromatic, the poorly tuned piano became charming. The discomfort of long hours, bad air, and uneven floors was edited out. What survived was a faint, lingering impression of time that moved differently, a slight awareness of a pause in ordinary life, and the soft hum of muted conversation that went nowhere. Even the social dynamics, which had been fraught with unspoken rules and careful observation, flattened in recollection. Patrons were no longer wary of unfamiliar faces. Bartenders were no longer calculating when to intervene. The constant awareness of possible raids and the tension of legality dissolved into the background of story, replaced by the idea of mystery or rebellion rather than the reality of endurance. In this way, the speakeasy became a story people told about themselves rather than a space they had occupied. It became a lens through which to imagine clandestine adventure, though the real experience had been slow, quiet, and largely uneventful. Most nights had passed without incident, and the longest stories came not from drama, but from repetition. The clink of glasses, the shuffle of chairs, the hum of the piano, the faintly sour aroma of bootleg spirits, the weight of time pressing gently against tired bodies. The city moved on. Laws changed. Buildings were repurposed. Patrons aged, left, or forgot. Staff found new work. And the speakeasy, once a necessary pause, a dimly lit refuge, ceased to exist entirely, leaving only memory and the occasional romanticized image in books, films, and anecdotes. And yet, that memory, faint as it is, preserves the essential truth. Life in a 1,920 seconds Chicago Speakeasy was not about excitement or heroism. It was about the quiet endurance of ordinary people in ordinary spaces. It was about occupying time under imperfect conditions, passing hours without expectation, and leaving when the night quietly dictated. In the end, that is all the speakeasy ever offered, and all anyone needed from it. Quietly, slowly, unremarkably, it performed its function and faded, leaving behind the soft impression of dim light, low conversation, and time quietly endured. Eventually, even the faint memory of those dim, smoky rooms became almost abstract. People remembered more the mood than the details. Chairs were uncomfortable. Drinks were inconsistent. Music filled the space without ever demanding attention. Faces were indistinct. Conversations came and went without consequence. The pattern of evenings arrive, sit, drink, talk a little, leave was repetitive, unremarkable, and exactly what made the experience tolerable. The city outside carried on in the same rhythm it always had. Streets remained noisy, factories and offices demanded attention, and life pressed forward without acknowledging the minor interruption happening behind a false door. The Speakeasy's existence did not change Chicago, and in that way, it remained unnoticed deliberately, and perhaps unnoticed by design. Even the people who worked there eventually dispersed. Bartenders went to legal bars. Owners repurposed their buildings or shuttered them entirely. Staff who had memorized faces, learned passwords, and monitored the subtle tensions of the room no longer needed to. The quiet vigilance, once necessary, was no longer required. Over time, stories softened. The awkwardness, the fatigue, the smoky air all faded. What remained was a sense of clandestine calm, a shadowy refuge, a pause from life's obligations. The mundane endurance of patrons and staff alike became romanticized. It became mythology, though, in reality, most nights had passed without incident, without adventure, and without transformation. History often seeks meaning in places that offered little. The Speakeasy resists that impulse. Its value lay not in drama, but in the unspoken permission it provided, to exist quietly, under dim light, with minimal expectation, and to let hours pass without disturbance. Life in a 1,920 seconds. Chicago Speakeasy was neither extraordinary nor heroic. It was simple, it was slow, it was tolerable, and when the night ended, the doors closed, the lights went out, and the room returned to nothingness. It left behind only the faintest echo of time endured. That faint echo is enough. Quietly,